and thank you to IDC for hosting this side event to the ministerial. And it's a pleasure to be part of this panel, albeit on such a sobering and very depressing, in fact, topic. I'm going to try to offer some remarks that help to connect Turkey to Lebanon and to broader developments in the greater Middle East, but certainly beyond. And I think one of the things that's so important about and significant about Turkey and its treatment of its Christian minority populations is that in many ways it's paradigmatic for broader features that we see in any society that puts its religious minority communities and ethnic, but certainly religious minority communities at risk. And so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes in a very kind of synoptic way, but I want to emphasize again this kind of the utility of thinking about Turkey for other cases. So I'll make three brief points and then offer some policy conclusions. The first point that I would make is putting the present moment in Turkey in proper context. How do we characterize what we're actually discussing? And to put it simply, we're discussing the possible extinction of Christians, of living Christianity in Turkey, as well as the gradual disappearance of physical evidence of their historical presence by virtue of a cultural and religious heritage policy that is very, very damaging. And this domestic reality is intrinsically related to rogue state behaviors by Turkey that I think were so emblematically described in Aram Hamparian's opening remarks regarding Nagorno-Karabakh, regarding Artsakh. So what we see in terms of Turkey's domestic abuses of its Christian minority communities and other religious minority communities is very much connected to Turkey's foreign policy of revisionism, adventurism, and militarism. So how did we get here, the context? I think it's important for us to recognize that what we're seeing today is not the function of 2 decades of AKP Islamist rule, but the last 2 decades are simply the latest chapter in an almost 100-year history that's shaped by the same pattern, but with different perpetrators and different valences. So just to sum that up, the current condition of Christian minorities, Armenian, Greek, and Syriac Orthodox Christians, as well as Roman Catholic and Protestants, and also the country's Jewish, Sephardic, and Romanian populations, but Alavis to a lesser extent as well. The current condition is the result of a kind of exclusivist, homogenizing Turkish nationalism that rejects pluralism, both as a concept and also as a reality. And this version of nationalism is one that was developed by the founding statespeople of the Turkish Republic, and certainly by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And I think it's important to stress this because this nationalist project, this exclusivist homogenizing project, was occluded and was covered under a myth of Turkey as a secular democratic state. And certainly prior to the election of AKP in 2002, November, this was almost the slogan for Turkey. Turkey is a secular democratic republic. Now, in fact, Turkey was never democratic, fully democratic. It was at best a kind of hybrid regime, had a very active civil society, and a civil society, in fact, with many advocates for broadening and deepening of democracy, and had elections, but those elections were regularly interrupted by coups, and there were tutelary institutions in Turkey, namely the military that we know well, but also the religious establishment in the form of the State's Diyanet, the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And so it's the toolbox that was created by this so-called secular democratic Turkey that has been utilized and deployed in the last 20 years by Kemalists. And I want to just lay out the basic tools because we read about them all the time now. But again, they were handed off to the Erdoganists, if you will. And those are violence, certainly Turkey's founding moment of genocide, but subsequently episodic pogroms and expulsions, a disenfranchising property rights regime that made it impossible for Christian communities to sustain themselves, a coding by the Ministry of the Interior and Education for those minorities to track them, revocations of citizenship, discriminatory work visas, and we've heard a lot about that of late, in particular being deployed against the Protestant Christian community, but these, have been deployed historically against all the minority communities, closing of religious educational institutions, interference in the election of religious officials, and as I mentioned before, cultural heritage policies of appropriation, commercialization, and destruction. So Erdoganism in that regard is simply a continuation of Kemalism. It's an exclusive nationalist project that's incompatible with pluralism, but the valence now is all about religion. And at best, in the early phases of the AKP, we saw an acceptance of discussion and somewhat of an inclusion of religious minorities in the Turkish nationalist conversation, but as separate and unequal, a kind of Jim Crow status for Turkey's Christian minorities, if you will. So that's how we got where we are. And I think it's important because as we move forward, for those who would say, well, a new administration or the outgoing administration should seek a return to normal, a reset with Turkey. There was never any normal when it came to the treatment of the country's Christian minority communities, and that's why they're at risk of elimination. A brief point on cultural heritage now. The decision in the summer for the reversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque, and the November 2019 decision and then implementation most recently of the same when it comes to the Hora Church are the most mediatized example of, as I said, a cultural heritage policy that under this Erdogan regime is rooted in a kind of neo-Ottoman model for controlling religious diversity. And again, there's continuity between the Kemalist and Erdoganist regimes, the use of the Ministry of Religious Affairs, the Ministry of Tourism, and the Ministry of Culture to either appropriate Christian heritage sites, to expropriate them and then commercialize them, or simply to destroy them. And as we know, the examples of Hagia Sophia and the Hora Church represent a violation of Turkey's obligations under its UNESCO obligations for those two as a World Heritage Site. But there are other countless examples, and I'll just give some data points. There are the conversion of three other Hagia Sophias at Nicaea Iznik, Edirne, Adrianople, Trebizond. There is the expropriation of the Senusarian Han, which was a 19th century Armenian school that was meant to teach vocational skills to economically disadvantaged children. It's converted into a police station, and now it's going to be commercialized in another bid to a private sector owner. There are what Aykan Erdemir has called the performance spectacles that religious leaders have been subjected to. The Greek and Armenian Orthodox patriarchs at the monasteries of Sumela and Akhtamar, once a year events that are performance spectacles by which these religious leaders are meant to perform for the Turkish state and the world that there is religious freedom in Turkey, but so the use of cultural heritage in that propagandistic fashion. And we could go on and on and on. There are so many examples. And this will lead me then to my third point, which is the foreign policy linkage. It's important, just as a footnote here, to mention that this cultural heritage policy is a policy informed by a logic of conquest that was explicitly stated by the Grand Imam of the Diyanet, Imam Ali Erbash, when he ascended the minbar in the Hagia Sophia, wielding an Ottoman sword and speaking the language of conquest. And incidentally, we've seen this in other places where Turkey has occupied. Turkish occupied Cyprus almost 50 years, where there has been wholesale destruction of religious and cultural heritage that is priceless for Christian communities, but for the world as well. Now we're seeing that in targeting of soft targets, churches, etc., and cathedrals, Armenian cathedrals in Artsakh by the Azeri client forces of Turkey, and we've seen it now in northern Syria as well. So going to a third quick point, and I think, am I over time? No, I think maybe I have like 2 minutes left. Okay, the link between domestic policy and violations of religious freedom rights for Christians and other endangered minorities on the one hand, and a foreign policy whereby Turkey, in rogue state behaviors, perpetrates the same kind of religious cleansing and cultural heritage destruction, as I mentioned, in Turkish-occupied Cyprus, in Turkish-occupied northern Syria, through clients, and then in places like Libya and in Artsakh with clients there as well. In terms of conclusion, what can U.S. policymakers do? The good news is that there's a lot they can do. It simply requires political will. And the other good news is that Turkey has been the canary in the coal mine that has long been ignored by U.S. policymakers, and that's why it's so relevant for a case like Lebanon, other cases in the region, and well beyond. Whether we're talking about China and its treatment of Uyghur Muslims, or what's happening with Muslims in Burma, Myanmar, or what's happening with Christians in other parts of the Middle East. So the good news is there is a toolbox, and using it and deploying it effectively will also send a message to these other cases. Just a short list of what could happen. The USERF and the State Department should support this, can designate Turkey as a country of particular concern for its systematic, egregious violations of religious freedom by every metric. And cultural heritage destruction is a violation of religious freedom. So we don't need to see violence in the conventional sense of the word in order to see that as systematic and egregious. So CPC designation. USERF's Prisoner of Conscience project highlights individuals that are imprisoned for exercising freedom of religion or belief, but that should extend to the intrinsic connection of other rights and freedom: speech, assembly, press, conscience. So adopting someone like Osman Kavala as a prisoner of conscience. The State Department's Cultural Property Advisory Committee should reject out of hand the request by the government of Turkey for a memorandum of understanding on the imposition of import restrictions to protect Turkey's cultural patrimony under the UNESCO Convention. Turkey has demonstrated it violates its UNESCO obligations, and that MOU should be rejected. And then finally, implementing CAATSA and Magnitsky sanctions. All of these will help to sustain what's left of those Christian minorities, will give traction to democratizers inside and outside Turkey, and will also be useful for a more effective NATO, both as a collective security alliance and a community of democratic nations. Thank you.